Welcome back to Midco Sports Tonight. We looked at the North Dakota high school football scene. Let's turn our attention to South Dakota, where there are some teams used to making the playoffs every year that are in danger of missing out on postseason football. Jason Andera gives us an updated playoff picture.
Teams like West Central, Yankton, Sioux Falls, Lincoln, and St. Thomas More have been fixtures in the South Dakota high school football playoffs for years. But if the playoffs started today, none of those teams would be in the playoff bracket. Let's break down the playoff picture. We'll start in 11 AAA, where the top 8 teams qualify for the playoffs in a 9-man class. Washington has some breathing room at number 1, with Roosevelt, Brandon Valley, and Sioux Falls O'Gorman all fighting to stay in the top 3 to avoid a potential semifinal game with the Warriors. The other battle to watch is the battle for the 8th spot. Rapid City Central currently holds that last spot, with Sioux Falls Lincoln trying to win their way in. Those teams faced each other back in week 1 when Rapid City Central won. That could be the deciding factor in who makes the field.
We were kind of struggling, we had our heads down, and we kind of were losing faith on the season, but this is kind of like the turning point for us, and I think we can turn this thing around.
In 11 AA, Mitchell and Pierre are sitting at the top of the class, with Harrisburg lurking just behind them. Pierre goes to Mitchell this week, then Harrisburg travels to Mitchell next week to help decide those top seeds. Again, 8 of the 9 teams in the class qualify for the playoffs. Right now, that 8th spot belongs to Huron, with Yankton sitting on the outside, an unfamiliar place for the 2014 and 2015 state champions. In Class 11A, we have maybe the most interesting race of all. We have 8 teams that qualify from a field of 17 teams. Heavy hitters like St. Thomas More, West Central, and Vermilion all sit on the outside looking in, with 4 and 2 Tri-Valley holding down that last spot. However, St. Thomas More has a chance to win their way in with an upcoming game against Todd County, who currently is at number 7. The top of this class is clouded as well. Dakota Valley, Madison are both undefeated at this point, with Del Rapids creeping their way up the standings. The Warriors face Madison on the last game of the regular season. That will go a long way to deciding those teams' seeding. In Class 11B and lower, the regional format is used for the playoffs. The top 3 teams from each region make the playoffs, and 4 more at-large teams join the dance. Some notable scenarios to watch. In 11B, let's look at Region 3. Bridgewater Emory, Woonsocket Wessington Springs Sanborn Central, and McCook Central Montrose all are playing well at the top of that region. But that leaves former top 5 team in the state, Chamberlain, in question. There's still a lot to track in the next 3 weeks of play that will determine playoff spots.
All right, very interesting. Well, joining me to talk a little bit more about this playoff picture is Jason Andera himself. So welcome, Jandy.
You bet.
Looking at this, a lot of important games coming up for seeding. I mean, as you discussed, but which ones are you watching the closest?
I think you got to look at Lincoln and Rapid City Central. They're both capable of pulling out some upsets, but they're struggling for consistency. So these next few games are going to be very important. Lincoln actually goes to Stevens, then plays Brookings at home, and finishes up with Washington, while Rapid City Central, they have a tough game ahead at Roosevelt this week. Then they go home for Washington and Stevens, so very similar scenarios for both teams. Both teams really want to get out of that 9th spot and make the playoffs at number 8.
Well, you talk about some teams that are used to being contenders but are pretty much in danger of not having any postseason play, so who are those?
Well, I'll tell you what, one of those teams is Yankton, the Bucks. They have been so good since we went to the 7-class system just a few years ago. But this year, they've been down in numbers, and it's really showed on their depth. They still have games coming up against Sturgis, Brandon Valley, and Harrisburg to finish the season. And I'll tell you what, they're going to have to win a couple of those games to ensure a playoff berth. This is a team that's won back-to-back state titles in 14 and 15. Last year won just 3 games, and this year just 1 win. So Yankton desperately needs to get back on track to make the playoffs.
Wow, all right. Well, you talked about some teams that are kind of in danger of making those playoffs, but which games specifically this week are you watching that you think will have the biggest impact on playoff seeding?
Well, seeding, it's got to be Pierre and Mitchell. Look at their schedules coming up, by the way. Pierre has to go to Mitchell this week, then they take on number 2 Roosevelt next week, which, by the way, is on Midco Sports Network, so make sure you check that out. Meanwhile, Mitchell has to host the Govs this week, and then they also play Harrisburg next weekend. So very difficult schedules for these two. Only the two teams out of that three bunch will be able to make those top two seeds, and they're both really gunning for that number one seed to have to avoid each other come semifinal time. So Pierre, Mitchell, Harrisburg, a very, very important trio of teams searching to get that number one spot.
All right, interesting. Good stuff, Jandy.
Bet.
Thank you so much. Well, next on the show, it's a Bison breakdown. Get to know NDSU defensive end Greg Menard, and then later a North Dakota showdown in head-to-head. This is Midco Sports Tonight.